Don Hagist, welcome to the archive. Today I'm excited to be talking about the Revolutionary War with you. Um, so I guess we'll just hop right into it. So the Revolutionary War is a bit of an interesting fact ping pong. There's a lot of people out there that say it's just the kings, and people say it was taxes. Um, some people say that it was a bunch of colonies established by people that back in Europe were fighting for their freedom, or were looking for new opportunities. And upon arrival, there were a lot of liberties and opportunities being stripped from them by the British government or the British king. And so today, not sure if we're going to cover all of it, but let's see how much of it that we can cover. Um,
All right.
so
Well,
what was kind of in your own work, what was really the beginning, that spark, that kickoff that really got the colonists at the time interested in rebelling against Britain?
that's a great question, and it is important to distinguish between the American Revolution and the Revolutionary War because the revolution began before the war began. A revolution occurred or a rebellion occurred which caused a war to happen. And we'll get to the details about that. And it's a neat question, and it's a really vitally important one for Americans to understand today because there are issues that factored into the start of the war that we still try to deal with today as a large nation of what we often say a large nation of smaller governments all under a larger government. So let's go back to 1763. Now we know the war that we're talking about began in 1775, but we've got to go back 12 years before that, which was the end of a different war, the French and Indian War, also called the 7 Years' War. Um, the French and Indian War applies to the part of the 7 Years' War that was occurring in North America. England, or Great Britain rather, won that war. And by winning the war, other governments ceded territory to them as a result of winning the war. So now there are a whole lot of people living in territories that were now under British rule. So in North America, the British government now had two new populations and an existing population that were all British subjects who hadn't been British subjects before. One of those populations was the mostly European settlers that were mostly along the eastern seaboard in the colonies that we're familiar with because they're now the eastern states. So that was one population. And these people were, again, largely European descent. They had colonized this area quite a long time ago. They've been here for 100 years or so, but these colonies were burgeoning in population and burgeoning economies. And lots more people, rapid growth, and they wanted more land. The second population that suddenly became British subjects at the end of this war were people mostly of French heritage who were in Quebec, the province of Quebec. We now just, I'm going to generically call it all Canada, even though the different provinces were more distinctive at that time than now. But so a whole lot of people under who were of French heritage, largely French speaking, and very Catholic, which bordered the New England colonies, which were very Protestant. And at this time, these two religions did not get along very well at all. Today we just, oh, they're all Christians. But at that time, the Protestants and the Catholics had a lot of beefs with each other. And there was a lot of disagreement about land in the area that we now call Maine. A lot of, again, settlers of European heritage trying to push out Native Americans who had been there since time immemorial, a lot of conflict over that land. Um, so the border between or really the division between the population in Canada and the population in New England was a significant one. And then the third population was all the other Native American nations that had been on this land from time immemorial. And again, these were, we tend to just blanket them all as the indigenous people or the Native Americans, but there were several very well established, very politically sophisticated nations that were in North America since before recorded history. And there was a lot of conflict over land because all these European settlers on the East Coast kept wanting to push westward. But now, all these three populations, the people of European heritage on the coast, the people of French heritage to the north, and the Native Americans to the west, were all British subjects, all under the British crown. What's the British government going to do to manage this? They want to keep everything peaceful and harmonious and give everybody fair play. So they passed some different laws. The key one was a proclamation that said, none of you European settlers in the East are allowed to take any land west of the Appalachian Mountains. That'll be a dividing land, and that is Indian territory. That's actually how it shows up on British maps for a while. So we've got Indian territory to the west, and anything to the east of the Appalachians you can settle. Well, the white settlers hated that idea. There were a lot of land speculators, surveyors, people already eyeing the Ohio River Valley, land out to the Mississippi. If you look at other British maps from the time period, you'll see colonies like Virginia and Pennsylvania just extending indefinitely to the west because that's how they were looking at it. So the British government now has a real problem. How do we keep the peace between these people who are, they're both very interested in land? So we're going to establish this line, this treaty line of settlement. We have to enforce it somehow. Well, the only way we know how to enforce this is we'll build a line of fortifications and we'll garrison those fortifications with soldiers. And that's going to be expensive. And we have a massive war debt from this French and Indian War. How can we pay for this new thing we need to do of keeping troops in North America? They had never had to do this before. Now we have to post troops there because we got all these British subjects who we know aren't going to get along with each other. So where do governments get money to pay for anything? They charge taxes. So the British government starts a whole series of attempts to draw additional revenue from the colonies by either enforcing existing trade policies that they had not been enforcing, such as the Molasses Act and the Sugar Act, or by introducing new taxation policies, such as the Stamp Act. And the colonists on the seaboard who are going to end up paying these taxes don't like this one bit. So they protest. A lot of violent protests go on. And you're probably familiar with some of them, but there are Stamp Act riots. There are homes being burned to the ground and things, people, tax collectors being hanged in effigy. Not very nice stuff. And this goes on for a few years. It's the hostilities and tension is worse in New England and worst of all in Boston. So in 1768, the British government sends soldiers to Boston to try to keep the peace. This goes badly because colonists want nothing of having soldiers among them. And we'll talk about that more in a minute because it gets to another important thing. 1770, you have this thing called the Boston Massacre, where soldiers were so harassed by people in the streets, by a mob in the streets, that eventually the troops opened fire. Several Americans were killed. It's politicized very heavily. So the British government withdraws the troops. Now for a while, there's a few years that are kind of peaceful, but British are still trying to find ways to generate revenue from these thriving colonies that have booming trade that had been unregulated for a long time. They try and they try and they fail and they fail. One of the key events that occurs a few years later is the Boston Tea Party that we've all heard of. And for the British government, the Boston Tea Party is the last straw. And they say, all right, we are shutting down the government of the colony of Massachusetts as a punishment for this. And they send a lot of troops to Boston, initially about 5,000 troops into Boston.
And what
And
was the population at the time for Boston, roughly?
I don't know offhand. I think it was on the order of 10 to 15,000 people altogether. The adult male population ended up being similar to the number of soldiers that were there.
Okay.
That's a good question that I don't have a detailed answer on, but
All right.
was
Yeah.
it was a lot of soldiers. Um, Americans didn't like that, and again, the catalyst for this was the British government saying we're shutting down the Massachusetts colonial government, and the people of Massachusetts said, "Too bad, we're just setting up our own colonial government." And that happened in 1774, and that's the rebellion that began. The colony of Massachusetts set up its own government in defiance of British law. So that's a rebellion. They called on other colonies for help and support, and the other colonies backed them up. There's this concept called the Committees of Correspondence. So these very separate colonial governments agree to work together. They agree to help out Massachusetts and support their claim of having their own government that's set up in defiance of British law. And that leads to militarization. The colony of Massachusetts starts really, they had a militia system in place for a long time, but the militia becomes very active. They start arming, they start training heavily, they start stockpiling supplies, which leads to the events on April 19th, 1775, the British trying to seize military stores in Concord, Massachusetts, which the Massachusetts colonists resist. And now you have a war that begins. So the Revolutionary War started as a result of the American Revolution starting. That's it in a nutshell. And this all took 12 years to gestate. You know, it wasn't a sudden thing. It's very easy for me to summarize it in 5 minutes, but think about reading the newspapers every single day or that time period every single week, going down to local taverns and talking to other people, talking to travel. What's the news from this place and that place? What's the British government doing next? How are things going? The British Parliament is trying to make laws, then they're repealing them again when they're unsuccessful and trying different things to try to come up with ways to generate revenue from these thriving economic engines that are the colonies. And they have good reasons to want to generate revenue from them. It's not like they're arbitrarily just trying to suck money out. They say, wow, it costs money to manage all these populations of British citizens. So what can we do? We need to put in court systems and we need to enforce trade laws, and all this costs money. We're trying to generate the money from the colonies. The colonists want no part of it. 12 years it takes from the beginnings to war breaking out.
So, I mean, we're looking at a 30% population increase, and they're trying to tax on every little thing possible. Um,
Not every little thing possible. They're trying to find individual things that the colonists will accept being taxed. They
okay.
try sugar and molasses. That
So it's
doesn't.
all
They
things
try
that
stamps.
are
So these they
big
try
generators
something, it
in
gets
money.
repealed. Yeah, they try a taxation law, it gets protested, it gets repealed. They try another different one, it
Okay.
gets protested, it gets repealed. It's important to recognize that these taxes, if you're a British citizen, you're paying a lot more taxes than the colonists are being charged for anything. These taxes are not excessive in their quantities. The issues that the colonists have is that each one of these colonies was established 100 years or more beforehand by a set of British laws. Each colony has what most of them call a charter. There's some other different sets of provisional rules, but each colony has a set of rules to follow, granted by the British government. Here's your permission to form this colony. And most of them said, in effect, among many other things, you can charge your own taxes and you can provide for your own defense. Now, these charters were granted when these colonies were little settlements, like little economic experiments, little clusters of people here and there. And over a 100-year period, the population's burgeoned. Now we have 3 million people in the American colonies when they had all started out as little groups of a few hundred here and a few hundred there. But all this time, they had been carrying on their own trade with each other, charging their own taxes within the colonies, providing for their own defense with militia systems. So the idea of having to then pay taxes to the British government, they said, this is a violation of our charters. We have these documents that you gave to us, and they said we charge our own taxes and provide our own infrastructure and independent from you. So they had a good reason for not wanting to pay the taxes, even if the tax rates were not excessive by any means. There's a few individual ones you can argue about because they had specific impacts. But in general, the taxes weren't high. It wasn't a high rate of taxation, but it was additional taxes beyond what they're paying to their own government. We can think about, imagine if every state in the US, if there were only state taxes to pay and no federal taxes, and all of a sudden federal taxes were going to become a new thing, that would take everybody aback a little bit. Um, so this is, and the other part that the colonists don't like is the colonies will provide for their own defense. Now, the British government wants to post troops in North America permanently. Well, that's what are you defending? Why do we need soldiers over here? We provide for our own defense. It's seen as oppressive, even though the original intention is to keep peace between the Native Americans, from whom the white settlers want to take land, and the natives who don't want to give up that land. The idea for stationing troops originally is to keep peace along the settlement line, but it becomes a means to keep order in cities like Boston, where there are violent protests against the revenue laws, which is seen as oppressive. Now you're quartering troops among the people. You're putting soldiers in our towns. We don't like this. And we have a charter that we feel you're in violation of. So
Okay.
this all making sense?
Yeah, this is
No.
making a lot more sense now.
Yeah,
Uh,
and both sides have very rational, legalistic arguments that they're making here. The British government's perspective is Parliament is the British government. And by the way, it's Parliament passing all these laws. The king is not even involved in any of this yet. We'll get to him later. But it's all the British Parliament passing these laws and the colonists protesting them. They both have good legalistic arguments. Parliament's point of view is Parliament rules all of the British Empire, so they can pass laws impacting any part of the British Empire. Fair enough, that kind of makes sense to them. And the colonists feel like, no, we have individual charters that say we pass our law, we charge our taxes, we provide for our defense. Different interpretations of established law,
okay.
which bottom line is both sides have a point.
Yeah, both sides. Yeah, it does have a point.
Yeah.
So, because Parliament's passing these laws, and kind of legally what they say goes, it goes to the colonies, and then the colonists are like, "Hey, wait a minute, why are these things being introduced?" And so they
Yeah.
legally retaliate. They can't legally retaliate. They protest. And that ends with this messy situation where there's some violent protests, tax guys are lit on fire. Eventually, some civilians are shot at by some sh soldiers. Um, all right, so this is painting a picture here. Now, After the Boston Massacre, from everything I hear, is that's kind of the point where the colonists decided, at least in secret, as it said, to plan a revolt against the government.
Dan, I would argue not until later. It was after the Boston Tea Party when, in response to the Boston Tea Party,
Hmm.
the British government shut down the Massachusetts colonial government, which was in Boston. They said, "Do you have to no more? We're taking over this colony. We're coming in and controlling it." And the Massachusetts colonists said, "No way. We're just setting up our own government." They set it up in Worcester, a few miles outside of Boston. Well, 20 or 30 miles outside of Boston. And the British government considered this illegal. This was the real rebellion. Now, again, nobody was talking about independence from Great Britain at this time. This was all protests against parliamentary taxation without representation. We don't have representatives in this government that is trying to pass laws that impact us financially. So they want representation. They, they're not talking about independence. They don't have any beef at all with the king at this point. It's all about Parliament it's all about governmental overreach as they see it. And they're not talking about, again, independence in 1774 and 1775. Some people, maybe individually, but the general call is not break from Great Britain. It's we want representation in Parliament, or we want to keep things the way they were and keep, keep managing our own trade, paying our own taxes locally within the colony, and providing for our own defense.
Okay. Okay. I'm liking where this is going. All right. So what is the next step in the series of events?
Well, as we know, war breaks out in 1775. We have a violent clash in Massachusetts on April 19th. It's not immediately clear to everybody that suddenly the switch has been flipped from peace to war. Um, we had this big clash between soldiers on both sides now, but now what do we do about it? Well, the Massachusetts militia surrounds Boston. If you look at a map of Boston in 1775, you'll see it's a peninsula. It's this little thing sticking out in surrounded by water. And the Massachusetts militia take the high ground all around it. There's just a narrow isthmus of land connecting Boston to the mainland. Now the British troops are trapped on there. Fast forward a couple of months, I won't go into all the detail behind it, but you have the Battle of Bunker Hill, the first real big battle where British troops in Boston are trying to displace some of the American troops that are on high ground around Boston. That's a little bit oversimplified, but it's a nasty, bloody battle. When word gets back to the British government about this nasty, bloody battle, which includes colonists not only from Massachusetts, but also all over New England, and I think some other colonies had also sent troops by this time. Now the king gets involved. He has the authority to declare war. They're pretty mad about this whole thing. Parliament wants to go whole hog and say we have to suppress this rebellion, and the only way to do it is by force of arms. The time for negotiating is over, not having it. And the king backs them up. The king says, "You're right, Parliament. We're going to go whole hog. I authorize sending a massive military force to America to suppress this rebellion. It's going to take some time to put it all together, but I authorize this." When word of this reaches the colonies, which again takes about a 2 month turnaround for the king to hear about Bunker Hill, make this declaration, make the king's speech, and for then information from that speech to get back to the colonies, they say, oh boy, first it was about Parliament, but now the king is on their side. The king's not backing us up at all. The only way to end this thing is to declare ourselves no longer subjects of the British king. We have to become independent from the British Empire, from Great Britain. So it's only after the Battle of Bunker Hill, a couple of months after the Battle of Bunker Hill, that the cry for independence starts to bubble up. It takes almost a full year before Congress passes that resolution, but it takes a while. But you see the evolution of we have a beef with these laws Parliament is passing to, wow, the only way we're going to get out of this is to have total independence from the British crown, the monarch.
Okay. So were there any key events that helped instigate this, or some things that might generally not get out to the public as much that may have helped orchestrate or construct the situation?
Sure. One that I talk about a lot is called the Quartering Act because it is so poorly understood in the United States today that there's actually a question on the US citizenship test about it, and the answer is wrong on the US citizenship test, which just shows how poorly it's understood. Um, Way back in 1763, we go back to the British government deciding it needs to post troops in the colonies. Move forward a couple of years because it takes some time for this to get figured out what exactly we're going to do. How are we going to do it? In 1765, the British government passes this thing called the Quartering Act. It's a law. An act is a law. And it says when we send British troops to the colonies, each colony is responsible for quartering them, giving them places to live, and provisioning them, giving them food to eat. So they're putting the burden of expense on each colonial government. If there's troops in New York, then the colony of New York has to pay for their quartering and for their provisioning. And if they move to New Jersey, then New Jersey takes over. Well, each colony responds to this in different ways. Pennsylvania and New Jersey, for example, said, okay, if we're going to have to quarter troops, they're going to need barracks, and they built barracks. And one of these barracks is still there today in Trenton, New Jersey. You can go visit it. Other colonies like Boston said, we're not doing that. They're going to have to figure it out. Well, the Quartering Act is very explicit, and you can go online and look up the Quartering Act of 1765. It says troops can be quartered in barracks, in public buildings, in inns or taverns, in barns or outbuildings, in any unoccupied building, but they cannot be quartered in private homes. And it's very explicit about that. In times of peace, you cannot quarter troops in private homes. Now, for some reason, Americans today think that one of the big reasons of declaring independence was because the British were quartering troops in private homes. And they never did that. It wasn't legal. They knew it. There were a lot of machinations over where can we put these troops if we can't, we need buildings to put them in. And again, for some colonies, not an issue. Pennsylvania built barracks. The main issue with the Quartering Act was not just so much, it was partly the presence of troops on principle, but also the colonial governments have to bear the expense of quartering and feeding the troops. And where do governments get money to pay for things? They charge taxes to their citizens. So by the British government saying the colonial government has to bear this expense, that forces the colonial governments to have to tax their citizens to pay this expense, which is sort of a roundabout way of the British government imposing a tax. Even though they're not doing it directly, they're imposing an expense. But that's effectively causing a tax to happen. And this is the big beef with the Quartering Act. You're forcing us to pay for something that we don't want to pay for. And our charters say we provide for our own defense, and you're saying you have to send troops over here. The Declaration of Independence, one of the grievances said the king has quartered troops among us, which means sent troops to Boston. Now, they weren't quartered in private homes in Boston. They were warehouses were converted into barracks, and the troops stayed in the barracks. But having troops in the city was a grievance that the colonists had. That seems like an oppressive thing to do. And we can see how today the US military does not quarter troops in cities and towns. They build bases, and troops stay there. Um, but there was never an issue. The British government never quartered troops in private homes in peacetime. Um, and the Quartering Act is very explicit that they weren't allowed to, but it did impose an expense on the people by imposing an expense on the colonial governments. Now, for some reason, our Constitution now says it's illegal to quarter troops in private homes, but that wasn't a response to something the British had done. I think that's more of a preventive measure, so so it won't happen.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's one of the, again, it's a significant thing that is widely misunderstood today. So I like to harp on it a little bit.
Yeah. No, I mean that's helpful to know.
And
I
this is another. It's like, if you don't believe me, you can go online and see the texts of the Quartering Act right there. It's it's very easy to find this out.
Yeah. So no, I have heard of the Quartering Act, but I have also heard that it was a matter of in private homes. So that's interesting that
Yeah,
it wasn't in private homes and that it
it
was
absolutely wasn't. It was among the people,
among.
which you've got to look at the language of the time. Among the people just means like here in town, not in my living room. you know,
Yeah. And then it was the taxes from that because they
it
have.
was the expense of it, which was going to then put a burden on the government, which then puts a burden on the people. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so that also makes sense. And seeing how they provide that attitude, if we provide for our own defenses now, it also seems to make sense as to why there was a Second Amendment written. Um, all right, so the Quartering Act, that was a huge cog in the wheel. Um, so the war kicks off. Um, we all know the outcome of that. Is there anything in it- we know that the French were very heavily supportive of the colonists because uh, France and England just don't get along.
Yeah, that's right.
Uh, what is there anything you feel like mentioning here or
I'll mention a few things. People ask me all the time, and again, people don't decouple the rebellion from the war. So they're talking about the war, but they say the American Revolution just in general. And they say, what could the British have done to win the American Revolution or to win the Revolutionary War? And my answer to that is, once war broke out, the British had already lost. It was all over at that point. War started because of a long series of poor foreign policy decisions that were governed by cultural arrogance on the part of the British. They didn't understand really what was going on in the colonies. They didn't understand the attitudes of Americans and colonists in general. They didn't understand really what the issues were that they had. Why aren't they just paying taxes? They looked on the colonies as children and on themselves as the parents. Now we just have rebellious children to deal with. Why won't they listen to us? It's like, well, because it's about more than just listening. You have to have dialogue, not just, assertive authority. So, so you can go campaign after campaign and say, if only this battle had gone a little differently, or if only the British Army had been more assertive there. And I don't think that would have helped. Possibly the immediate war could have ended sooner in favor of the British, but the rebellion would have remained by that point, and war would have just broken out again or something. But without some kind of a negotiated settlement to recognize that the American colonies were far too populous and far too economically prosperous to not become some kind of to have to change the relationship with the British government. That relationship had to change somehow in order to have a peaceable resolution without the colonies just becoming independent. And the British government didn't seem to get that. So these colonies were too big, too populous, too prosperous by 1775 to maintain the same kind of colonial relationship that the British government had with lots of their other colonies and that they had maintained for decades earlier.
Okay. Okay. So in your opinion, regardless of the cultural arrogance or not, do you think that separation from the colonies and the British government was inevitable?
I'm not going to say separation was inevitable, but modification of the relationship was necessary.
Mhm.
It had to have happened. If there was no change in the relationship, then yes, separation was inevitable.
Okay.
Um, the examples that I see other historians use, and this gets outside of my areas of expertise, but if we look at Canada today as a nation, which is part of the British Commonwealth, Australia is an independent nation that's part of the British Commonwealth. Well, what that means is eventually the British government figured out that we can't just keep them as colonies. We have to change the relationship between the British government and these other places that are now big and populous in order to keep them as part of our British Empire. And this whole concept of Commonwealth, again, this is outside of my knowledge of how they worked that, but the Commonwealth of North America could have potentially been a thing if they had been wise enough to work through that. It, probably American independence led to the development of this concept of Commonwealth nations that are separate but still part of.
Okay. So the Commonwealth was a result of
I again, this gets out of my immediate sphere of expertise. I'm like strictly American Revolution, but somehow the British government worked it out so that other places, again, like Australia and Canada, stayed connected to the British government in a way that the United States didn't. And the United States didn't stay connected because the British government didn't have any conceptual way to allow that to happen at that time.
okay. Okay. Neat. A very neat thing to ponder on. All right. So, conclusively to try and keep it within the time frame, uh, post-revolution.
All right. Sadly, my expertise is weak once we have a peace treaty in 1783. But if you went into a betting house in London and tried to put odds on the new United States of America staying together harmoniously, I bet the odds would have been pretty slim. You could have won a lot of money betting that the colonists would stay together for a few more decades because the colonies had a lot of differences. And just becoming independent from Britain, initially they were still 13 individual colonies with individual governments. They had this document called the Articles of Confederation that was sort of supposed to keep them together, kind of like the European Union sort of concept. We have 13 individual colonies. We call ourselves the United States. And it was recognized to be unworkable. So within a few years, we got to 1786. Everybody knows this is not working. We need to do something different. And by 1787, you got the Constitutional Convention. Delegates from each of these independent colonies, independent states, come together to try to form a viable central government because they know it's necessary. You just cannot have each of these states. The Articles of Confederation don't work well because they're poorly constructed. They require unanimous votes on everything. Um, we need a central government. The constitutional convention gets put in place. And here's where the remarkable thing occurs. People call it the miracle in Philadelphia, and very rightly so. Somehow, all these delegations from different colonies that have wildly different opinions on a lot of topics recognize that it's more important to come to some kind of agreement than it is to stand individual ground on every single point. And they find a way to create the US Constitution that we have today. Well, with a few amendments, of course, but they developed this new kind of government. Um, it's called a democracy, and there aren't any others of those on the planet at this time, at least not big thriving nations with democratic governments. Um, it is a republic as well as a democracy. A lot of people, there's this phrase people use today, we're a republic, not a democracy. Well, those are like you know, that's not a dichotomy right there. We're a democratic republic. And that's not a simple thing to create. It's not a simple thing to maintain. But the brilliance is they set up this nice governmental system where you have elected officials, you have checks and balances, you have a judicial system and a legislative system and an executive system. They're all supposed to check and balance each other. You have representation from all the different states. When the Constitution was ratified, everyone who created it knew that it was imperfect, that this was the best we can do right now. And it's going to need modification going forward, but at least we got something. They recognized it was more important to come away with something that could work rather than trying to get something that everybody felt was perfect. But they saw the importance of, we got to work together and compromise somehow. We're not competing with each other to try to, one side is out here to defeat the other one. We're all trying to work together to come up with something that is satisfactory. It had a lot of recognized deficiencies. You may have heard this thing called the compromise about slavery, which I can't remember exactly the term for, but
Briefest
some colonies had already illegalized slavery and others had not. And it was recognized that we have to come up with something that will work for now. Even though there was a lot of disagreement about slavery, it was recognized that it wasn't ready to just be universally abolished at that time. And some people really slammed the founders for that. But if they had not made those choices, we could have ended up with two separate nations straight away. Um, so it was important that people at the time recognized this is an evolutionary thing. We put together something that is remarkable, different than any other government in the world, and we got to find a way to make it work, and we got to move forward with it, even though we know it's not perfect in every way.
Yeah. All right. Well done. I do want to say thank you before we go. Are there any honorable mentions or you got a new book coming out or anything?
Oh, well, I always have a new book coming out. I tell people once you open that valve, you find out it can't be closed again. Yeah. Yeah. My expertise is on, I write books about people who served in the American Revolution, not famous people, but common folk, mostly soldiers and mostly British soldiers. I do this because other people haven't done it. So, but right now, the book I'm working on is about wives and children of British soldiers in America during the Revolutionary War. Soldiers' wives were deployed overseas for similar reasons to why the US Army will let families go to places like Japan and Korea and Germany where US troops are posted. Because if you want to keep good soldiers in your army, it's a good idea to accommodate the dependents somehow. And these women played a role in the military infrastructure of the era, not on the battlefield, but other things that the army needed. And I'm working on a book about that because it's an interesting topic.
Yeah, that sounds like a very interesting topic to hear about. Yeah, nobody really covers quite often the lives of soldiers and armies through history, or the
Yeah.
children that grew up going from one base or one area to the next. So,
Yeah, and there were children like that back then too. And I've
military
been working on
families.
I've had the good fortune to be an advisor on the PBS documentary on the American Revolution produced by Ken Burns that'll be coming out in November, which tells a really it presents a very accurate, very multifaceted picture of the American Revolution and its impact on all sorts of people in the colonies at the time. So, I highly encourage everyone to watch that.
Yeah. Well, Ken Burns is always he's always a quality chap to watch.
It's a very high quality piece, I can tell you that. They've done a remarkable job so far, and it's almost ready.
Awesome. And quickly, any honorable mentions or funny stories from the Revolution you want to share?
I'll tell you a quick story about a British soldier named Martin Hurley. He was a soldier in the 44th Regiment of Foot, arrived in Boston just after the Battle of Bunker Hill. He was an Irishman, and he did what a lot of British soldiers did, about 5% of them. He deserted from Boston. Well, he gets to the American side, and the Americans need men who are skilled in the military arts. And he's a trained British soldier. So he very quickly gets from the Boston area to New Jersey, well away from the front lines at that time. And they make him a sergeant in the New Jersey Continental Army. And then they make him an officer in the Continental Army. Now he's Ensign Martin Hurley. 2 years later, it's the Battle of Germantown outside of Philadelphia. And the British have a great plan to try to trap and defeat a British army encamped in Germantown. Things start to go wrong during the attack. British troops hole up in a big stone house and put up a massive defense. And the Americans think, well, we can't let them just stay there. We have to take that house. So Martin Hurley leads the charge, sword in hand, leads New Jersey troops against the Chew House in Germantown. What could go wrong for him? Well, the attack fails and he doesn't get killed. Something even worse happens. He gets wounded and his comrades abandon him on the battlefield. And the tides turn and British troops come forward, including the 44th Regiment that he had deserted from 2 years before. And here he is with an American commission in his pocket. And everybody saw, oh, yeah, he's the guy who was leading that charge. So they pick him up and they court martial him almost immediately. And quite a lot of testimony against him because right there in Philadelphia are the people he deserted from. Yeah, I know that guy. I was there when he enlisted and all that. And in his defense, now a lot of British soldiers, when they were deserted and they were caught, they used as a defense that, well, I got drunk, I wandered off. I'm so sorry. I did come back. It's my first offense. Give me mercy. So Martin Hurley tries that. He says, well, yeah, sure, I deserted. And yes, I got a commission in the American Army as an officer. And yes, I led the charge, but it's the first time I've ever done such a thing. And I'm really sorry about it. So can you give me mercy? Well, the court didn't buy that one bit and he was executed for desertion and bearing arms in the rebel army. And an interesting thing is if you pick up a book, there's a registry of American officers during the American Revolution that says he was killed at the Battle of Germantown. It's
Wow.
like, well, no, he wasn't killed at the battle.
He was executed thereafter. He got
Yeah,
marshaled.
He was a British deserter, and he got picked up, and he was executed for desertion and taking an active part in a rebellion. So there's
Yeah.
my interesting story to close out.
All right. Court-martialed before execution. I like that one. All
Yeah.
right, Don. Thank you again for coming on.
Oh,
And
you're very welcome.